So every conference likes to think it's going to have a new presentation, and our next presentation is just that. We have two presenters, and Katie, you might want to come this way, and Antonia the other. So our presenters are Antonia Antopoulos. No, I've got that wrong. I'll do that again. I do beg your pardon. I will try again. Antonia Antopoulos. That's worse. I will give up at that
Try
point.
one more time, Barry.
No, it's never going to improve.
Antonopoulos.
Antonopoulos.
Yes.
That's it. Okay. And Marsden and Sarah can just stop smoking now. Took me half a dozen times to get Nahawi right the first time. So our presenters on stage, Antonia is the communications specialist, monitoring and evaluation at UNICEF, and we're delighted she's here. And behind me is Katie Delahaye-Payne, founder and CEO of Katie Payne and Partners. Welcome.
Thank you. So this project started, the idea came last year, and in a nutshell, what we wanted to find out at UNICEF was, what is this elusive thing called engagement? And we always throw that word around, and we always say that, we want to have higher engagement on our social media platforms. And we never had any sort of standard or defined metric to actually hold ourselves either accountable to or to just benchmark ourselves with. So, the main essence of the study was just trying to get a more nuanced understanding of how people engage with us on social media beyond likes and shares and the quantitative counts we had. We wanted to do something a little bit more qualitative that would also result in benchmarks for us and that would force us to actually define what we meant by engagement. So, you all know the steps involved in most measurement programs. And so what we were lacking here was we didn't have defined metrics. We had sort of a vague goal of increased engagement, and we didn't have our benchmarks. So why did we want to measure engagement exactly? And one was just accountability, because again, we kept defining goals of engagement that were vague. And that didn't help us at all. We had, right now we have almost 1.4 million likes on Facebook globally on our global account. We just reached over 1 million Twitter followers on our global account. And this doesn't include our various country offices and regional offices that often have their own Twitter handles and their own Facebook pages as well. And again, regions will have their own regional social media platforms that, depending on what's most popular in their region. So one was an accountability issue. Second was investment. So when we first started our social media platforms, they were more of the broadcast type of variety. So whatever we were putting on our website would just get reduplicated again onto our social media platforms. And this was okay for the beginning, but then we made a decision to restructure within our global division of communication so that we would have a special social media team. We invested in that financially and human resource-wise so that we could increase engagement. Again, this whole thing about increasing engagement and making engagement that was more meaningful rather than just the more broadcast variety. So part of this was also in terms of looking at, what did this investment actually result in? So in terms of getting specific, as I said, we already had the fans and followers, and was largely and overwhelmingly positive what was happening on our pages. But we just felt that likes and shares were a little bit superficial, or rather they were the first rung of engagement, and we wanted to have a better idea of what higher levels would look like and what that would mean. We also knew in terms of the comments that we were getting that we had a lot of, what we sort of, lovingly called our cheerleaders, because it was stuff like, thank you, UNICEF, and UNICEF, you're great, and thank God for UNICEF, and that's all nice and fine, but we were hoping that since we talk about engagement, that there should be some sort of evidence of that left in the comments that are left on our Facebook page, or the kinds of tweets that are going out, that would indicate that somebody had some more thoughtful understanding of the work that we did, that they had some more critical kinds of questions, etc. And we just wanted to get a better understanding of that, what that would look like. So this is where we enter Katie. But before enter Katie, what actually happened is, again, we had all the quantitative data that everybody has, but we wanted some sort of qualitative analysis. So we started to think, okay, well, how can we do this? And the idea was, well, why not take a sample of comments and retweets, et cetera, and do some kind of content analysis. We can come up with our own sort of coding scheme, similar to what we would do in regular media content analysis, and code for what we would want to see, and determine some sort of level of engagement. And I just assumed that that was the kind of thing that was being done. And so I reached out to actually some people in this room that I had met in Lisbon last year to find out who's doing this, and have you heard of any case studies that you could share with me so that we can develop this method. And all the responses back were, well, I've never heard of that before, I don't know. So there wasn't really anyone that was doing it. And then we put out, when we advertised for the consultancy, nobody had the experience in this for people who had applied, except for Katie, who is the one person that I had reached out to who actually had examples of having done this for some nonprofits in the US, and she already had a coding scheme developed. And so we worked with her to develop a customized one for UNICEF. And at this point, I will pass it over to Katie to describe how we went about doing this.
Thank you, Antonia, and thank you, Barry, for letting us show you this, because it really is kind of exciting. We had, for a long time, been talking about different levels of engagement, and you'll hear tomorrow about standards and all the rest of the stuff that we've been talking about, but we have been talking sort of forever about different levels of engagement, different types of conversations, trying to establish some norms for some of these kind of amorphous things. One of the things we had said was there are 5 levels of engagement. Well, turns out that, yeah, there are 5, but you really only need 3. It wasn't necessary to get into some of the granularities. Way back when, in 2005, I think Stowe Boyd came up with this thing called an engagement index, which is just the ratio of comments to posts. So we'd been using that for quite some time, just as a sense, just as a single number to get a sense of whether a particular post was generating any kind of levels of activity. But where it got really interesting was, this is sort of, the rubber hits the road is the American expression, was that when we started to apply this to UNICEF, we realized that there were several fundamental flaws with what we were doing. First of all, there's no lack of engagement in UNICEF. Everybody loves UNICEF and wants to say, yes, congratulations and thank you and happy birthday to their ambassadors and all these other things. So all of that level really wasn't terribly meaningful to them. And yeah, we knew that there had to be some kind of higher level of qualification, but we really didn't know how that was going to play out. And so what happened was that Antonia gave us some examples of what she considered sort of casual greetings, thoughtful comments, expressive comments, and then high quality. Well, it turns out that high quality comments are really more message rich. I mean, they cross the boundary between what we would call a type of conversation, which is casual greeting, or expressing complaints, or expressing support, or any one of those things that we've used before. And there's a chart up here that I'll show you. But we'd used them effectively before, but there were too many of them and they didn't really apply. So we really had to come back with a slightly different definition, and that was these 5 levels of the quality of engagement. The methodology was fairly standard. We collected everything that we could find in a 3-month benchmark period. We developed an auto-coding system to classify it and to weed out all of the spam and the bots and all the rest of the stuff. 40% of what we collect these days seems to be generated by something that's not human. So we screened out all the non-human stuff, got down to what was actually real, and then human-coded 10% of it, a valid sample of it. So what do we find? Now, the first thing we find was we said, okay, let's start with the simplest number, which was the average engagement index over time. And what we needed to do was to say, okay, what was generating the higher levels of engagement? And I, for some reason, obsessed over a completely irrelevant sexist theory was that, you know, pictures and stories of pathetic girls would be more engaging than pathetic boys. For the men in the room, it's not true. Basically, there's absolutely no statistical validity, but I was just curious as to whether there were any sort of overall rules of, you know, what was going to generate greater engagement. Turns out that I was completely wrong, that mostly it was driven by not something UNICEF was doing alone, but the fact that there were news events going on. So that some of these things were driven by UNICEF in particular, but they were also enhanced and augmented by other things that were going on. So, for instance, Martin Luther King Day, or what was the other one? The Mother's Day, Mother's Language Day, New Year's Day, things like that were going to generate fairly high levels higher levels of engagement, rather than things that UNICEF was doing just on its own. We then looked at other definitions of engagement, including comments and tweets on Facebook and Twitter, and what was generating them. And again, what we found was that there were some specific programs that UNICEF was putting out there, like the Tap Water Project, and certain specific photographs. But really, the biggest one that we found that really correlated best was UNICEF's Goodwill Ambassador programs, in particular Mia Farrow, and we're going to talk about her a little bit more in a minute. But one photograph on New Year's Day that they put out there. And again, they have huge amounts of assets. The question for them is, of course, you know, what assets do you use? What assets are going to generate the higher level of engagement, the more thoughtful levels of engagement? So we looked at average of likes and average of shares over time, assuming that shares are a higher level of engagement than likes. And this is where, you know, all the theories sort of went out the window. Because in fact, as you can see, David Beckham and Dierks Bentley, you know, very high level. Mia Farrow, not as high a level. But the celebrity names were always going to generate the most likes. And basically, it goes back to engagement theory, which says that a lot of people like things, share things, and forward things because they want to look good to their friends. And if you have a lot of friends who are football fans, then you're going to like a lot of David Beckham. And if you have a lot of friends that are, shall we say, perhaps older people who know who Mia Farrow is and support her cause, then you're going to be more likely to share and to like those things. As I said, we had developed a number of years ago 27 different types of conversations, and the credit to this goes to a man named Peter Kowalski, who is way too academic for this crowd, but and most of the stuff he says I don't even understand. But what he did was he looked at a whole bunch of sociology theory and content analysis theory and created these 27 exclusive different types of content. In reality, we end up grouping them most of the time anyway, but what you can see is that a tremendous amount, 57%, expresses support for UNICEF. So whereas for other nonprofits that we've worked for, expressing support is a huge definition of success, right? I mean, you want that number to be going up over time. It's, you know, it's their key performance indicator in many, many cases. In this case, they were already there. So while all of these different definitions of types of conversations were useful, it wasn't as useful as it was for in some other cases. And we also found, not a whole lot of criticism, lots of greetings, things like that. And again, the question in all of these numbers is, so what? Right? So what if everybody expresses support? The question is it the right types of support? So this gets back to what Antonia defined, which was the difference between high-quality expressions of support and not so high quality. And the definition is, and I'm going to turn this over to Antonia to let her explain in her words why the high-quality definition is so important.
Well, the reason, so again, we're looking at, the cheerleaders that I mentioned earlier, and again, we're grateful for all kinds of support, but part of our efforts as the global communication team at UNICEF, we don't do fundraising. We have a separate fundraising office in Geneva that that looks at donor relations, et cetera. And for us, it's, we're analogous to a PR function. So without having that, call to action to say, please donate now, what our main goals are around raising awareness and, this thing called engagement, and it's, partly educational. So, while we don't expect Facebook to be some sort of intellectual forum for people, we would hope that there would be evidence on it that people have learned something new, that they might be, taking some sort of action, that they have some sort of nuanced understanding of the type of program work that we do. Presumably, if you are a fan and you're watching, reading, or looking at some of our comments some of the time, then this type of this should somehow be reflected in this analysis. And of course, there's other ways to get to that through polling or interviewing. But there should, we chose to just look at this as the scope of this particular study. And thoughtful and expressive comments are things like, again. Oh, thank you, UNICEF. It's so great what you do. Keep up the good work. And, that's, again, wonderful. But a more high-quality comment would demonstrate that, somebody has an opinion about the work that we do. And even if it's not necessarily positive or totally in agreement with us, that's fine, too, as long as it shows some sort of critical thinking, some sort of analytical thinking around the topics and the issues. If somebody has an opposing opinion, that's great. As we want to see that. We want that conversation to happen on our page. And so this is why the high quality thing was so important for us, because it takes it into, we've invested in social media. Again, we already had the likes and the shares happening from before, but we're trying to say that we're trying to reach some more meaningful level of engagement with these tools. And are we doing that? And as you can see, the high quality comments were under 10%. So is that fine? Well, we don't know. We never measured it before. So now we have some sort of benchmark and understanding. I don't, we'd have to do a similar analysis on peers' pages or something to see how we fare up against them. We haven't done that. But I think this is not so surprising from what we know about Facebook in general. And we weren't surprised by that. Actually, it was a little higher than what I thought it was. What I thought it was going to be. And that, one, it sets us, we have a benchmark now that we can hopefully increase, but it also raises other questions for us in terms of, what are some more realistic expectations that we can have of social media, and also, if we do want to do more of this educational, in-depth kind of engagement, maybe there's other forums that are going to be more appropriate for that. And we haven't answered those questions, but this gives us some evidence to take to the table when we enter into these discussions during our reviews, et cetera.
What it also allowed us to do was to compare the various different campaigns that they had in terms of what was generating the higher levels of engagement. So if you assume that shares are higher levels of engagement, and then it turns out that the anniversary of the Haiti earthquake, again, things that revolve around anniversaries where other news things were already going on tended to generate higher levels. than some of the things that UNICEF was doing on its own. And it sort of goes back to the nature of social media, which is that it's an enhancement, it's an augmentation of other forms of communications. It's not necessarily a standalone. So if your news bureau is also being very active around these areas, and that's supplemented, and you're working closely between your social media group and your news group, it's going to generate higher levels of engagement. And one of the other things that I wanted to say is that we were really trying to also figure out, once we identified the thoughtful comments as the real goal for UNICEF, then we were able to say, okay, what is really generating the high quality comments? What were generating the highest quality of comments? So while we found that photos and videos, absolutely highest level of engagement, no doubt about that. UNICEF has fabulous assets of videos and photographs. Not surprising that people want to share them. Not surprising also that David Beckham generates the highest number of likes, but Mia Farrow is generating a high level of engagement. But more importantly, if you think about it, right, Mia Farrow's fans do tend to be older. Older people do have a tendency to be a little less reactive and a little bit more thoughtful. So the concern that UNICEF had was the fact that what we don't want is, we don't want people saying, oh my God, Mia Farrow's in Africa, I'm going to run to Africa and adopt a baby. Right? That's not useful to them. In fact, that's a negative message to them because it's going to cause all kinds of problems. So for these thoughtful, high-quality comments, you're much better off with a Mia Farrow, who may only have 40,000 fans compared to 4 million that David Beckham has. But those 40,000 fans are a much better audience for that particular message. They have a tremendous number of goodwill ambassadors, and there are different uses and different applications for each one depending upon the interest of the goodwill ambassador. But it also turns out that they're going to generate different types of engagement and different qualities of engagement. As I said before, one of the things that we do is we eliminate all the auto spam and all the rest of the stuff. However, one of the things that we found that we had to be careful about was that Charity Tweets is an auto tweet service. It collects tweets about charitable programs and nonprofits. However, it's a subscription service. It's essentially an aggregator of tweets and news links and things like that about charities. And that turns out to be a very big part of UNICEF's engagement. Quotes from senior leadership, not surprisingly, also generated a high level of engagement. Different topics, child survival generates more engagement than some of the other programs. And again, remembering that social media is just one aspect of an incredibly complex thing, that all the different things that the Division of Communications does at UNICEF, but it does say that perhaps some of these other, one of their big ones is childhood AIDS and HIV, and not a whole lot of engagement around that on social media. So maybe that particular area needs some other form of media to be discussed. And we talked about this yesterday a little bit, which is that, and we really only looked at Twitter and Facebook for the purposes of this benchmark, because that was where they were being most active. It may well be that Quora or Pinterest or Tumblr or someplace else, one of those other social media sites, as they get more active on them, will be a better source for some of these higher quality. But now we have an index by which we can judge whether activity on Tumblr is going to generate the level of high quality engagement that they were looking for.
And just,
yeah, go ahead.
Just an additional point to make to those findings is that they were also, this wasn't part of the study, but just from our media analysis, our standard media analysis, they're reflective of that as well. So, child survival, for example, is one of 5 of our main programming areas, others being basic education and gender equality, child protection, HIV and AIDS, and policy advocacy. And that child survival always gets the lion's share of our coverage in traditional and online media, which is not surprising just because it's easier to understand and it evokes probably the most empathy from people. So to see that also happening on our owned properties where we actually have more control to push out content across those areas, and yet still that area gets the most impact is insightful for us. Also, so again, that photos and videos are more compelling, and we know that creates higher favorability ratings on our traditional media. International days and anniversaries seem kind of boring often, but we do get a lot of pickup in traditional media around those, or just announcing a statistic. Our coverage usually peaks over things that we think are not as interesting as, say, releasing some more nuanced feature. And yet we see the similar things happening on these platforms.
One thing, and one of the other things, if you'll see the post with purpose was our recommendation. It's easy to, sometimes it's very easy to get engagement if you tap into the right passionate comment thread there. So they had posted on when SOPA and the internet privacy issues, it was a relevant post that did connect to UNICEF's mission. But the 300 or so comments that it got had absolutely nothing to do with UNICEF. The comment thread went completely off track and started attacking Facebook and privacy issues and a million other things, and got into politics and all kinds of other things that were completely irrelevant. So when you are posting and making those decisions about what kinds of things to tap into or what types of hot buttons to tap into, be aware that there are, you might want to do some research ahead of time to figure out where the comment strings go, because especially anything having to do with politics these days, yeah, you're going to get 500 comments. You're going to get a very, very high engagement index, but it may have nothing to do with what you're trying to get accomplished.
Yeah, and that was, again, as we shifted from this broadcasting model to a more engaging model, we have this team of young consultants working on our social media, and part of their strategy was to post things just to build relationships. So things on Martin Luther King Day, or around SOPA, or just things that are interesting in general, just to get people interested. And this was just a reminder that that's fine so long as you always make sure it's on message and connected. So that was an important reminder to the team. Another important insight was, Katie just alerting us that, we might want to consider the medium and matching the medium to the message, and that social works well for visuals, et cetera. But if we're looking to do this higher level of engagement, we might want to, focus a little bit more on, we have a Voices of Youth blog, and perhaps there's other forums that we're going to get that meteor connection with people. And again, we haven't reached any kinds of decision on this, and probably will stay the course for a while. But when we do end up doing reviews that relook at budgets, et cetera, this will be this provides some evidence to show us, well, where exactly do we want to put our resources, or again, just temper our expectations with the medium. So, and also with, we do a lot of Goodwill Ambassador outreach, and our Goodwill Ambassadors will tweet and post on our behalf. And this is just, again, a reminder of how important that strategy is.
And I think that I'll give Antonia the last word, but the point of this whole thing is the fact that, we've all been sort of talking about these amorphous things for a long time. This was a benchmark. It was a learning experience, I think, for both of us. We put a marker in the sand so that they know, 7% is where they are now. They know that they can increase beyond it. But the other thing is that now the systems have been set up, right? This is now, there are standard numbers that will come in that will enable them to decide in the future, okay, if I'm going to devote resources to this, well, let's measure it according to this, so according to these categories. so we know whether, in fact, it's worth it going forward.
Just to wrap up, we now have some, clear benchmarks that have translated into, some smarter KPIs for us. It's the first time we actually have definitions of, low, medium, and high level of author engagement, and also, some kind of a definition around the qualities of conversation. So again, before it was just always spoken about in more vague terms, and now we actually have some criteria that's concrete. Now, we just kind of made it up as we went along, but it's something, and it did force us to get specific. And again, this will come into play when we're making some future decisions. We have, there's also interest in repeating the study, of course, to see how we've fared at the end of the year, and to make this part of our process. And the results are going to be shared within the wider UNICEF network. We have a community of practice globally that has over 300 participants in it, where this type of information is shared on a regular basis. So it's also, just want to say that from last year in Lisbon to this year, I'm really amazed at how much progress has been made, because the presentations last year around social media versus this year are just so much more, rigorous and specific. And in UNICEF, where, communication-wise, the measurement culture is not very strong. It's, not something that, we are, we're still learning with it. And the social media measurement has really been a gateway into increasing interest in getting support for wider communication measurement, just because it's, it's easier to do in the sense that there are so many tools available, and you can quickly produce charts and graphs, et cetera. And then that makes people working on other things like publications or, whatever, to get more concrete about measurement. So this type of study has wider effects for us as well, in terms of, garnering interest and support for wider measurement programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting observation about Lisbon to Dublin and the rise of interest and use in the room of social media. And we're not done yet. We've got a whole morning session on social media and social media measurement tomorrow. UNICEF, represented by Antonia, is a member of AMEC's North American chapter, and she was always very keen to make this presentation today, and I thank you for that. I understand why now. So let's go to questions, please.
Thomas Stöckler. Thanks, Antonia and Katie. That was a really, really interesting presentation. Fascinating stuff. What I'm interested in is basically the next step. Where do you go from here? How far can you dig into segmenting audiences and on top of evaluating how much engagement there is and the quality of the engagement? Who's actually engaging, and how that can be prompted, and how it can be managed, based on what we all talk about, business objectives towards towards real outcomes, whether they are intangibles, reputation, and goodwill towards UNICEF, or ultimately tangible, funding, stuff like that. So are you already working on cutting this by socio-demographic variables and things like that? What's going to happen next?
I'll tell you from our perspective, what the first level is also when we looked at the level of engagement, identifying those individuals, we identified those people, the personas of those people that were most engaged and least engaged, and all those different levels of people. So the first cut was to look at the types of people that were more engaged and less engaged, because I don't really care about their demographics if they're not engaged at all. I mean, I do, obviously, Antonia does, but what we were trying to identify was sort of what makes somebody become more engaged, regardless of where they were. The other part of it, which is what's valuable to UNICEF, is a little more challenging.
Yeah, and also part of the study was to identify specific people that had specific authors that were engaged at a higher level so that, we could tap into them. And this is just, one part of a very wide social media strategy that exists within UNICEF. So the team is using tons of, tools, both free and paid online, and they're using Radiant 6 to identify conversations happening and outreach to that as well. Now, we didn't include that type of outreach and a wider analysis. We just decided for this study to stick to our own platform since we felt that was what we had most control over. So there's definitely a lot going on with the social media strategy of UNICEF and globally coordinating. We're in 192 offices, and again, each office has its own social media feed. So as of this year, we are putting out packages with key messages, et cetera, that can go out globally. So definitely there is a plan. As I said, a new team has taken over the handles as of January 1st of this year, and next year we're going to do a full evaluation as well of encompassing a whole scope of things. So I'll let you all know when the RFP is put out.
And also just to say, the tricky thing about UNICEF is when the donate here goes to somebody else, so it's not a funding is not the call to action, the messages are the call to action. So it's a little tricky when you're trying to do that. We're doing other things with other charities to work on what you're talking about, which is tying the social media back to actual revenue, but that's not the UNICEF mission.
For our division of communication globally, it's not part of one of our goals. Yeah.
Question in the back.
Quick question, Mark Westerby, Spectrum Insight. Interesting in you're talking about individuals. One of the issues that we're very aware of is privacy. And particularly with commercial brands. I suspect it's not quite so difficult with something like UNICEF, but certainly for our clients, the whole issue of privacy and actually identifying people individually is an issue. Is this something that I'm sure you're aware of it, but how do you address that?
Well, again, these, like for Facebook, they'd be comments that are, everybody could see anyways. So it's just being conscious of maybe, making sure that you respond to those people when they actually leave a comment next.
Yeah, and remember that we're only seeing what's public, right? We're not going on there as we're not faking identities here. We're just going on there and seeing the 10% of the Facebook feed that is public.
Hey, Katie. What do you do with 27 conversation types? What?
I know who you are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Angela Jeffrey, measurementmatch.com, and also representing Karma International.
Perfect.
Thank you. 27 different types of conversations. I've read this from your book and so forth for some time. What the hell do you do with that? I mean, is there not a way to collapse that down into fewer types?
Yes, yeah, there is, and we frequently do. The academic, the rigor that Peter put into this thing said that you have to have 27 individually identifiable. I don't know. We did it because he's an academic and he told us to. In reality, we sometimes do. Almost always do. In reality, yes, we frequently collapse them down. You can very easily collapse them down. I think there's expressing criticism, there's expressing dismay. You can collapse them down into negative types of conversations, neutral type of conversations. But we collapse them down depending upon what the goals of and the mission is of the organization we're working for. Because for, in one organization, expressing support is terribly important, is the highest level of importance. For UNICEF, they want something else, they want more of a nuanced understanding. So you have to collapse things down depending upon the organization. It's always better to start out with the 27 and then collapse them down specific to the goals of the organization.
We'll take one quick one.
Richard Bagnall from Gorkana Group. It's a question for Katie. Katie, you looked at 10% of the posts and comments and tweets and everything. you said you looked at 10% of the content. What tools, techniques, method did you use to select the 10% of the content? I'm thinking particularly with things like the Facebook posts as well.
There are two different 10%, right? The reality of life is that of all the conversations that are going on in social media, anybody in this room with all of your tools, you're accessing about 10% of what's actually going on, because the rest of it is backed behind privacy walls or other walls. Then from the 23,000 or whatever it was that we collected, we just did a random sampling. I mean, it's just a tool that we use to select a random sample of those, and it was 10% of Twitter and 10% of UNICEF.
So you put it into one of your databases and then random sampled it that way? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
We had one more from the very beginning.
One more from the beginning, down here.
He's raised his hand
it's
first.
Philip, okay.
Thanks, Philip from Kantar Media. I'll be very quick. So we got the numbers for engagement and the nature of engagement, and that seemed to be primarily direct engagement with UNICEF. So I'm wondering if the study also extended to see how this was resonating in terms of, recommendation and the ripple effect further out into social media. It would seem to be a good measure of the strength of UNICEF's message.
We kept it for the scope of the study just to our own platforms, but in a future more comprehensive study, then we definitely would want to look at that wider landscape as well, for sure. Do more of a 360.
Yeah. Okay.
And in reality, when you're searching for all the UNICEF stuff, we picked up that stuff anyway, so it's there. We could look at it. It just wasn't part of the scope of the study.
Okay, thanks.
We're going to go for a break now. Just before we do, we are tracking Twitter quite hard. And there was a mischievous tweet yesterday that I just want people to know that we took note of, that there was a particular session with some senior industry leaders in the workshop, and the mischievous tweet was, no woman on the panel. So I just draw your attention. That all our presenters this morning have been very senior ladies. So I'd like to thank Antonia. I'd like to thank Antonia, Katie, Sandra, Karen, and Anna. Great session to start us off. Thank you. We're back at 11:15.